So we've heard, of course, that Michael Gove's planned reforms to the leasehold system are being watered down. He, of course, wanted to cap ground rents. What's your reaction to it?
I mean, it's disappointing. It would have been extremely hard, and what we've seen is it's been hard for him to get this through without being watered down, and we saw similar with the Renters Reform Bill. And I often talk about renting, I talk about social housing, but one of the biggest scandals at the moment is with leasehold, it's with ground rents, it's with service charge. And looking at the stories today in the news and the papers, the fact that leaseholders are worrying about having their homes repossessed if they missed a bill of only £350 off of the back of a cost of living crisis, I think is absolutely obscene. I think there has to be more support there for leaseholders. They're not enough, and it's causing misery for so many up and down the country at the moment.
Is this just another example of reforms to the housing system that are announced, that are planned, crumbling away as soon as they hit the first hurdle?
I think so. I really do. I mean, tackling this sort of housing crisis, including the leasehold scandal at the moment, isn't something that's going to be fixed overnight. What I've always been clear about, though, it's going to take huge reform, and that fundamentally is what's needed. These policies, it won't be successful if all of these policies are watered down. But what we're seeing with leasehold at the moment is that's the case. It is being watered down, and there's now question marks over whether it's going to be enough to create the change that is needed for so many leaseholders up and down the country. I mean, we're seeing the scandal with service charges at the moment. It's not only ground rent that leaseholders are currently worrying about, it's also service charges. I've spoken to some myself in the space of a year, seen it increase by hundreds of pounds. And we all know, we've all been through the cost of living crisis altogether. We know our bills have gone up, the cost of rent have gone up, everything else included. And that's the same with leaseholders. They are now worrying that they're going to have their homes repossessed off of them by freeholders. And it's almost as if they're at the mercy of these freeholders. They say jump, leaseholders are expected to say how high. And fundamentally, I think there has to be intervention, there has to be reform, and there has to be more support for leaseholders out there.
I'm interested to get your perspective on Michael Gove, because you know him, you've worked with him before. He seems as a bit of a reformer. How much of a personal disappointment do you think this will be to him?
It would have been huge for this to be a success. Having had meetings, and listen, I'm not here to pour glitter on any sort of politician, any MP or anything, but from my meetings with him, I do believe that he wanted to create changes, whether it comes to the Renters Reform Bill, Social Housing Regulation Bill, but also Leasehold Reform too. So if it is the case where it is being watered down in the way that's being suggested, I do believe he will be disappointed. I think perhaps he's going to have to take a firmer stance. Ultimately, we need reform to be as strong as possible. I mean, consecutive governments have let leaseholders down, they have let renters down. And ultimately, we now find ourselves in a situation where we have some of the worst stock in Europe, for example, and it is going to take drastic reform to fix that. He's tried to table this and bring it forward. He's obviously struggled. So I do think personally he will be disappointed, but we're going to have to think about alternatives. We're going to have to think about how do we make this cross the line? How do they make sure that it has the best impact it possibly can? Because for so many people, they are looking towards government now and in just absolute obscene misery.
And then just zooming out for a minute, how big an issue do you think housing is going to be at the general election? And I'm also interested to get your thoughts on whether Labour's being ambitious enough on housing.
I've made it clear, housing, I believe, has to be top of the agenda when it comes to the next general election. Housing isn't a sort of lone issue. When we think about it, housing affects the lives of every single individual up and down the country, whether you are homeless or whether you live in a five-bedroom home, whether you're a leaseholder or whether you're a renter, whether you're living in social housing. And it doesn't just affect that, it affects kids, it affects their education, it affects the NHS. And we've seen that with social housing, the amount they've had to spend on looking after people living in poor conditions. And for generations, we've seen that housing has never been at the top of the political agenda if it's not them promoting home ownership. They've not talked about leasehold in the way that they should have. They've not talked about social housing, which is the bedrock to this crisis at the moment and the heart of this crisis. And they've not talked about renters reform. And so many people up and down the country, their housing is impacting their lives, is causing them misery, and they are struggling with their bills. I fundamentally think we need the next government to be radical, with reform when it comes to housing. If they cannot talk about improving the country's productivity, improving the country's labour force, if people are living in unsafe, undecent homes or struggling to pay their bills or are at risk of homelessness, they cannot do that. And I think the same message has to go, whether it is Conservatives or whether it is Labour. I think pressure needs to be applied equally, because the next government is going to have to take drastic action in several areas across housing to really fix it.
Do you think they get it from what you've seen from the Labour Party and the Conservative Party? But I guess I'm talking about the Labour Party for a minute now. Do you think they get what you're just saying?
It's hard. It's difficult. I've been in meetings with Michael Gove, that's the thing. And I've put these issues forward. I've shown him, I know that he has seen it. But again, it takes a whole party. When it comes to the Labour Party, they're talking a lot at the moment. They're telling us, especially around social housing and renters reform, that they're going to do X, Y, and Z, but we're not really seeing the details at the moment. Are they going far enough? Am I convinced they're going far enough at the moment? No, is the answer. In relation to the crisis that we're seeing and the scale of the crisis, are they tabling enough of a sort of radical approach to tackling it? I don't believe so, but I don't think any party is at the moment. And they're going to have to, because the whole country is looking towards them in relation to housing, because so many people are being impacted by it.